Are continuing our coverage of an unprecedented time in history. The country now has a former U.S. president that is a convicted felon. A jury of his peers found former President Donald Trump guilty on all 34 counts in his New York criminal trial. Here with me now is David Canon, professor of political science at UW-Madison. Thank you so much for joining us on the show, David.
Good to be with you.
So, David, I want to first talk a little bit about Thursday's verdict and your response to this. I mean, this is the first time that we are seeing a former U.S. president be convicted of a felony. Does this tarnish the presidency in any way?
Well, clearly it's not good news for Donald Trump, and I think a lot of people were surprised at how quickly the jury reached their verdict and the fact that they were unanimous on all 34 counts. I mean, a lot of people going in thought it might be a hung jury, especially because there were two lawyers on the jury, which is fairly unusual. Often prosecutors don't like to have attorneys on a jury because they're the ones who will find that little technical reason that makes it that it's not beyond all reasonable doubt for a conviction. But they were able to get unanimous jury verdict on all 34 counts. And some people thought also maybe other than a hung jury, they also could have maybe only found the former President Trump guilty on some of the counts, like for the checks that he signed, but not the other vouchers and journal entries and so on. And so there were a lot of things that could have gone much more in President Trump's direction, but this was the worst possible outcome for him for sure.
Sentencing for this trial is set for July 11th, just 4 days from the Republican National Convention. Is there going to be an impact there?
Well, right. I mean, there could be, for sure, although everyone's saying that it's extremely unlikely that President Trump will see jail time for this. While he could, it's a Class E felony. It's the first offense for him, and so it's extremely unlikely he would actually have jail time he would serve here. The other possibilities, the other most extreme thing could be house arrest. I think that's also unlikely. So most likely would be probation, or even it could be something less than that, perhaps even just a financial a fine, and maybe someone said, community service and counseling. That's kind of hard to imagine President Trump out there like picking up trash on the playground or something. I doubt that's going to happen. But on the other hand, it is quite possible that it would be probation, which could affect the campaign, because then anytime President Trump was to leave the state, he'd have to get approval from his probation officer. Now, what is also likely to happen, I think, is that any of the sentence, anything in the sentence could be stayed or put on hold while the case is being appealed. And so that is something that it could mean that nothing is likely to happen to President Trump at all until the appeal plays out, which is likely to be after the election.
Former President Donald Trump's Republican allies have argued that the trial was an effort to interfere with the election and that the judicial system was rigged against Trump. Trump and Republicans have continued to reference that before and since the verdict took place. Will this rhetoric have any bearing on how voters respond to the outcome of the 2024 presidential election?
Well, pretty clearly, it's the argument that is resonating with his supporters, that they are angry about this. They say that Trump is the victim here, and that clearly is a strategy that President Trump is pursuing in how he is going to present this to the voters. There already were indications late in the week that the fundraising just blew up on Thursday, right after the verdict, that all monies just started pouring into the Trump campaign. And so pretty clearly, I think Trump supporters are motivated by that argument that Trump is the victim here. But the problem, I think, is that in a court of law, that kind of argument doesn't fly. You have to actually have evidence that you present that says why it was rigged. And on appeal, they'll have to show evidence of why it was rigged. And here, I think they really aren't on as strong ground as they could have been had they pursued an alternative strategy. Because what they did in their defense was the strategy that President Trump has always employed in the courtroom, which is basically to deny an attack. And so he denied that he had the relationship with Stormy Daniels, that Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen are liars, and then to attack everyone that said otherwise. If they had pursued a different strategy, then I think they were on a much stronger grounds for appeal, which would have been the fact that in order to get a felony conviction in this case, the falsification of the financial records had to be tied to a second crime. And that's the part where most legal experts say they were on shakiest legal ground, that they tried to tie it to a state law of conspiracy to influence an election. But this is a federal election. So it was a kind of novel legal theory to get into, but that's deep in the legal weeds, and they thought they could just win and be able to win the jury's verdict by just their traditional approach of deny and attack. But again, in a court of law, you can't just make claims that something is rigged. You have to show how it is. And so they weren't able to convince the jury that Michael Cohen was a liar because they never provided an alternative theory. Were the jurors supposed to think that he paid that $130,000 out of his pocket and wasn't going to be reimbursed? And so of course the jurors were going to believe him. And so I think it does weaken Trump's position on appeal, because the things you can say on a campaign stump, that the jury was rigged or the whole trial was rigged for political reasons, that's not going to fly in a court of law on appeal. They have to have some good actual legal reasoning to be able to win that appeal.
I want to talk more about the January 6th trial. There are a few more cases that are set to take place, but we don't know the time frame of when those trials are going to get started, especially considering that the election is in November. Would they have any bearing on how voters choose to cast their ballot?
Right. So the ongoing trials, I mean, depending on where they are in the process, they definitely could have an impact on voters' decisions, especially the January 6th case. If the Supreme Court were to allow that to go forward, that could be huge. And even if it does get kicked back to the district court, they probably will start the process, the trial at district court, of trying to sort out what would be covered by executive immunity and what wouldn't be. And there will be discovery, where all this evidence will be coming out. And so it'll be in the news, in September, October, probably, if that does go to trial, at the district court, to try to sort out that question of immunity. And so even if we don't have a verdict, in any of those other three cases, and I think it's quite likely we will not have a verdict in either the January 6th case, the documents case, or the Georgia case. I think it's unlikely we will have a verdict in those cases. But if those trials are started and are ongoing, that means it'll be in the news in a way, again, that will not be beneficial to Donald Trump.
A huge question that is on the minds of a lot of people is knowing whether President Donald Trump will actually be able to vote in the November election. Is that a possibility?
Actually, there was some confusion about this in the media when this first was raised on Thursday. And some people immediately said, well, felons in Florida can't vote, and so Donald Trump won't be able to vote for himself. Well, it turns out it's a little more complicated than that. Because in Florida, if someone's convicted in another state, not under Florida law, but in this case Donald Trump was convicted in New York, then the underlying law that affects the ability of felons to vote is the state law in which the felon is convicted. And so Donald Trump is a resident of Florida, but he would be governed by the New York law on felon voting, not the Florida law. And so as long as President Trump avoids jail time, he would be able to vote, because under New York law, if you're a convicted felon in jail, you can't vote. But once you're out of jail, or if you're just on probation or anything else, you can vote. And so Donald Trump, in fact, would be able to vote for himself in November, unless there's a conviction which involves jail time, which, as we talked about before, I think is extremely unlikely to happen.
David, certainly a consequential time for the country right now. David Canon, political science professor at UW-Madison, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Good to be with you.
And up next, the perspective from Republican Congressman Brian Stile. We'll get his reaction to the Trump trial verdict and the policies he wants to see at the U.S.-Mexico border.